There is some brand new reporting tonight on the Justice Department's intensifying investigation into Donald Trump's potential mishandling of classified documents down at Mar-a-Lago. According to the New York Times, federal prosecutors have obtained the confidential cooperation of a witness who worked at Mar-a-Lago as part of special counsel Jack Smith's probe. Specifically, Smith is reportedly investigating whether Trump ordered boxes of classified material moved from a storage room on the premises as federal investigators attempted to retrieve those boxes. The report cites multiple people familiar with this inquiry. The DOJ has been interested in Mar-a-Lago surveillance footage that captured these boxes of documents being moved around. And now we are learning, again, according to this reporting from the Times, that investigators are looking into the handling of that surveillance footage itself. To get to the bottom of what happened, the DOJ has apparently issued a wave of new subpoenas and gotten grand jury testimony, including testimony from two of Trump's longtime allies who appeared before the federal grand jury today. Matthew Calamari Sr., who is the chief operating officer of the Trump Organization, and his son, Matthew Calamari Jr., who is the Trump Organization's corporate director of security. Those men are among the Trump world figures who may have insight into the handling of that Mar-a-Lago surveillance footage. Now, the reason for this new interest in that camera footage is this. Back in October, the Washington Post reported that Walt Nauta, Trump's sort of body man, told investigators that after Trump was issued a subpoena last spring for any classified documents that remained at Mar-a-Lago, Trump himself directed Mr. Nauta to move boxes of documents. At this point, prosecutors believe that Mr. Nauta did not give investigators an accurate account of what exactly went down. And so they're now attempting to learn more about the movement of those boxes. One person told The Times that prosecutors have also questioned a number of witnesses about gaps in the security footage. Gaps in the security footage that may be key evidence as to whether Trump tried to hide boxes of government records from the government. So, yes, that would be of interest to investigators. And there is more. According to The Times, a previously unreported subpoena to the Trump Organization sought records pertaining to Mr. Trump's dealings with a Saudi-backed professional golf venture known as Live Golf, which, of course, is holding Saudi bankrolled tournaments at Trump's golf resorts. I mean, it writes itself. Joining us once again is Mary McCord, Executive Director of Georgetown Law's Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection and co-host of the MSNBC podcast Prosecuting Donald Trump. Mary, let's first start with the notion that the DOJ has a cooperating witness. How meaningful is that? And the search that they are presently undertaking to find out what went down with the security footage. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, this is a story that just, it seems like every day there's new developments here. And certainly in any investigation like this, the department would be looking for cooperators, not just one, but preferably more than one. And it does seem from this reporting that they have someone who's got some inside information, an employee at Mar-a-Lago. And that's really key because, you know, they need to get inside, you know, that building and figure out what was happening when, because I think one of the things that's most significant about this investigation is the potential for obstruction of justice charges. I mean, I've said all along, if this was just about classified documents being taken to Mar-a-Lago and being promptly returned after they were discovered, I don't think we would be even talking about a criminal investigation. But that's not at all what happened. And what seems in many ways to be some of the most significant information here is what kind of actions did Trump potentially order after he was subpoenaed to try to make sure that the documents that the government was looking for did not get turned over to the government. And I think this new reporting about seeking the business records with respect to the Saudi golf tournament businesses, you know, this makes you also think that the government is again trying to figure out why was Trump trying to obstruct? What was he worried about, right? And so I think that's getting again to his motivation.
Well, I mean, are we supposed to infer from that potentially the government thinks that the Saudis were in a reason why Trump may have been holding on to these documents?
So, it's still so early to tell. There could be all kinds of reasons for that subpoena, even things that we haven't even, considered. But one of them, I think, could be either is there something that, at its worst, is there something that Trump wants to share, right, with a foreign government? And that, of course, goes to the heart of sort of the mishandling of classified information and the vulnerability to information being shared with people and governments who are not entitled to be in possession of it, information that could cause grave and in some cases exceptionally grave harm to the national security. So one thing is about, is there a risk that some information might have been things that the Saudis would have wanted to know. But there's less extreme examples, too, just that there could be something in there even about the Saudis that he wanted to hide to try to protect them. There's so many possibilities here. But I think that, my best guess is that it is going to sort of some of the motivation, for what appears to be potentially efforts to obstruct, efforts including misleading or even lying to his own attorneys.
The fact that they are involving Trump Organization officials in the search for this again, we don't know, but is that suggesting that Trump directed officers of his organization to potentially tamper with the surveillance footage that would have showed the boxes being moved around? There are so many questions. Mary McCord, we have to leave it there, but thank you for sticking around for Double Duty tonight. I sincerely appreciate it.
My pleasure.